Hey everyone, welcome back to Tea with the Supremes. Julie here with Cass, Ebony, and Savannah.
Hey.
Hello, everyone.
Hola, how is everyone doing today? Great. Okay, wonderful. Welcome back.
Cass is going to take the lead on our conversation today. We have April's a big month for a lot of things. So I'll let her explain it and we'll get started.
Yeah, so in light of yesterday's Spotlight Sunday, we figured that we would kind of continue the conversation. So April is Child Abuse Awareness Month, and I think that that's something I think as a collective, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's something that we talk about because it's important to recognize the signs and symptoms, and us as counselors, like, we're mandated reporters, so if we see something we really have to say something. And I know, Savannah, you work with kids, so I know you're a mandated reporter, and there's a whole set of training that you have to go through depending on your state to become a mandated reporter. So to start, I found this website called childhelphotline.org, and it outlines the 4 different types of child abuse. So there's physical, emotional, sexual, and neglect. So physical abuse can be any act of violence, accidental or intentional, that results in an injury to the child. This may include punching, kicking, shaking, stabbing, throwing, biting, choking, burning, or hitting with a hand or an object like a belt or a switch. There is emotional abuse, is the most difficult category to define, and unfortunately the most difficult type of abuse to investigate. Examples include harsh criticism, name calling, derogatory comments, shaming, threatening, withholding love and affection, and possibly exposing children to domestic violence. And then sexual abuse may include inappropriate touching, being forced to have sex or engage in sexual acts, being forced to watch pornography, being prostituted, or having someone expose themselves to the child. And neglect, the fourth, is a failure to provide certain basic necessities of life, including food, water, adequate shelter, or appropriate supervision. Not getting medical care or not being taken to school may also classify as neglect. So yesterday we were talking about the gender affirming care, and in terms of a child abuse lens. So let us continue the conversation, ladies. I'm curious if you think any of these 4 fit into what we talked about yesterday.
I think anybody can make them fit. I don't think they necessarily have to fit. And I want to clarify something. So when we were doing our Spotlight Sunday, and I know I spoke specifically about younger kids because that's where I personally struggle with 2, 3, 4, and 5. The law in Texas was about teenagers, and I still think that's an iffy place. But I think your personality and your is being solidified in that developmental stage, and so some things you can voice. Your voice is you're finding your voice, creating your voice, developing your voice in that stage. So I think that takes a different perspective. But to say it is abuse, for me, that's a hard place, because culturally speaking, my upbringing, you would say a lot of the things that happened to me as a child would be abuse. The way I was disciplined, the way people I know that they were disciplined, other cultures, the way they discipline their children, um, by all intents and purposes, according to today's standards, a lot of that is abuse. And some of it went too far and it was abuse, but that doesn't mean all of it was abuse, right? And so we can shift the narrative any way we want to shift the narrative to fit whatever you're saying. So I think that's again a slippery slope. I don't call that abuse. um I think that's an overstretch to call it abuse.
So you made me think of something. So many times people in my generation and younger are frequently told that since we are more accepting of different um, lifestyle paths and different sexualities and races and ethnicities, all of it, we're more accepting of everybody. We're typically seen as more sensitive and more like we don't have thick skin type of thing. So do you think that, how do I word this? Do you think that this is going to an extreme because the child, Jane Doe, is seen as not having thick enough skin to know who they are, and they should be able to stick up for themselves? Because I was just having this conversation with a coworker the other day, and they're like, so many people in your generation are so sensitive and blah, 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 all this stuff. I'm like, well, because I care. Like, I genuinely care about humans. I genuinely care about the people that I interact with on a daily basis. So yes, I am sensitive. I'm always going to be sensitive. I cry when it rains. I cry when it snows. That's just how I am. But I'm also a very empathetic person. So I'm very open and willing to listen to other people's stories. And as a counselor, you have to be an empathetic person. Like, you have to be willing to at least hear what your client is saying. And whether you process that in the moment with them, you process that later, however you work it out, in that moment you kind of have a poker face. And for me, that's something I struggle with. So when I read something like this, like, I just get a really bad like gut feeling, and I'm like, F Texas, not only for this reason but for many other reasons. F Texas, and like, this is ridiculous because, one, a parent should parent their child how they see fit. However, you should not take it to those extremes of what abuse actually is. And like you said,
Yes, I
stretching
agree
this
there.
to abuse is a very big stretch, because all the parent wants is for their child to feel accepted, not only by them, but by their peers. That's all you want as a child. You want, or as a parent, you want everything wonderful. You want rainbows and butterflies for your kids. It's not always going to be rainbows and butterflies, but you want everything to go according to me. Like, my parents always had a plan. So they wanted everything to go according to plan. And you guys can confirm or deny that, but I know we've talked about that in the past. That was a whole lot. I just threw up at you guys.
Um, well, I'm going to answer and say that it's not a yes or no for me, which is, I see a lot of this. I don't want to be contradictory to what I'm saying, because it's, so at least for the first question you asked, um, I think in part, yes, your generation has, and I don't know if it's so much that your generation was more accepting or your generation was exposed to more and you had the ability to accept that you were exposed to more. I think that's true. However, and the flip side of that is, I think your generation, they do need tougher skin, because everything is not going to be rainbows and roses, right? Like, everything is not, there has to be that whole accountability in that entitlement thing that has made, people have bowed and catered to so many things of your generation, things that we used to say, old school did it this way. Well, they were too harsh. So we have now evolved and we're going to be better. And each generation should evolve and you should do better. But old school worked for a reason. Not all things. I'm just saying, as far as toughening up, because a lot of people that got to your, that was in that are in your generation when they got to adulthood, they couldn't take chastisement. They couldn't take correction. And they, because everybody was coddled. And I think at some point, there's a point where you stop coddling the baby and you allow life, you got dirty, you fell, I held you the first couple of times. Then the next time I'm going to need you to get up because I'm not going to always be there to coddle you in the process. So I think it's both in that respect. I think something that your generation got right was that they were exposed to a lot more. So that that level of empathy, that level of acceptance and understanding, that benefited them because they were exposed to so much more things that was hidden in the closet. And I don't no pun intended, but that whole entire lifestyles and generations, and all those things. So I think it's been a double-edged sword, if you will. But there are effects to both sides of it, both sides of the scenario. And I don't know. I know you were being facetious in the Texas gets a lot wrong. They get a lot wrong. But okay, well, let's just hold that but. Okay, wait. So we'll pause and hold that but. Oh yeah, yeah, they get a lot wrong. Don't get me wrong. And since I'm so close, there's a lot more that they get wrong that's just not publicized that they get wrong. So, but
as a parent, it's hard to find that balance of let them figure it out. Parents step back, and then wanting to protect them and shield them from all the bad things that happen. And I feel like, to a sense, over coddling and just helicoptering too much, for me, I feel like that's I can't think of the word, but I don't think of it as child abuse, but I do think of it to a point that it's too much and it's unacceptable and you're doing more harm than you are good.
Yeah, for sure. I think, it could go both ends of the spectrum. Like if you're way too involved or neglectful, either way, if you get to the extremes on any side of anything, I think it could definitely be problematic. Speaking to the generational piece, though, I think that a lot is made of it. I think for all generations, I also feel like so much of it is just generalizations. I don't think that the vast majority of my generation are sensitive. Speaking from experience with people in my generation, I think a lot of them are. I think the difference is it was not acceptable to voice the kindness. It was not acceptable to voice the empathy. It was not acceptable for women to speak up about sexual harassment. Those were not commonplace. So I think a lot of it is the realization that the status quo was garbage and I need to push up against the status quo. So I think that's a lot of it. That's why so many people are more vocal about things that they weren't necessarily vocal about before. So a lot of people do view that as, oh, look at how sensitive everyone is because they're complaining about this or that or what have you. And a lot of it is people are saying you should have been complaining about this, but you didn't have the opportunity, or you didn't have the voice, or you didn't have the platform. Also, speaking from my generation, I know a ton of people that are super sensitive, and I will say myself included, that we are tough. So I think a lot of it is generalizations in that respect. And I don't think that necessarily plays into the gender affirming. I do think there's there's definitely more acceptance. I will say one more thing to the tough piece. If you just think about how much our children are exposed to and how many avenues of just, call it bullying, call it harassment, whatever, that they are subjected to repeatedly, consistently throughout their young lives, they have to learn to navigate stuff that we never had to navigate. So that in itself makes you have thick skin. Like, they're tougher than we give young ones credit for. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. I don't think overall it's just a gross generalization of everyone's super sensitive. But I do think for the most part, being accepting is more vocalized now. I think that's more what it is.
I have two small little stories for that. So on the navigating piece, I remember so vividly, I was in 6th grade and this person had made a Facebook page. And this is like when Facebook first, like everybody started making Facebook. So I was, yeah, in like 6th grade, 6th or 7th grade. And somebody made a Facebook page because that's when like pages started getting really big and you could start liking stuff. Somebody made a page called People Against Me, my name. And number one, that was earth shattering to me. Number two, a lot more people came to my defense. I have really bad social anxiety. So I didn't think anybody would really come to my defense. And a lot more people came to my defense than I ever thought would. And my mom didn't know how to navigate that. I remember I didn't even tell her till like 2 weeks later, till like all the page got reported and taken down. And I had just mentioned it casually in a conversation. So like that kind of stuff, that's the type of trauma that like I grew up with the online trauma and the online bullying when online bullying really became like a big thing. Yeah, I just so remember vividly. And it was like this picture of this large lady, large, luscious lady eating a cake. And I'm just like, and I look back at pictures of myself and I'm like, I wasn't even fat. Like I was cute AF. Like I was a cute little girl, you know? So that, and then I remember to the piece of parental emotional abuse. I remember when I was 18, and this was right after the situation happened that we talked about it in a previous episode. If you could go back to season 1 and listen to the story that I shared. We had gone on vacation with my dad and we were walking in like downtown Disney or something like that. And he goes like, I bought myself a necklace as like a grounding tool because that's when I started getting into mindfulness and really learning how to recognize my emotions in the moment. And my dad was just like, why are you so sad? Like you have nothing to be sad about. And I'm like, I have a lot to be sad about. Like, yes, I am humble about my upbringing. My parents gave me the world plus more. They gave me everything I could ever have wanted. However, that didn't fill the void of the emotional connection I needed with my dad. So, in terms of that, like that lack of connection with my father was really emotionally hard for me, being an empathetic person where I want to connect with everybody and I want to love everybody. And yeah, so I'm curious. Yeah, those are my two little side stories.
I love that you said that though, because as you were speaking, the thing that you needed was the relationship. And that's really what the core of it is. That's the same with the gender affirming care. It's the relationship, and the relationships are at the core of everything. So it's really like we as a society, we need positive relationships. If there is positive relationships between parents and children, there's not child abuse. So it's building foundational relationships, loving relationships that can communicate to one another. That's a big deal.
When I was growing up, like my dad would always say, your mom just wants to buy your love. Like all she does is buy you materialistic things. And whereas like my dad was there for every single game, every single activity I did, he was there in the stands. My mom was never there, but she would make up for like, oh, I'm going to buy you this. Oh, I'm going to buy you that. As a child, that was cool. It was exciting. I loved it. But like, I always looked for my mom in the stands or on the sidelines of whatever I was doing. And my dad was a hard ass growing up. And it's like, I hated him growing up because of that, but he like gave me this emotional connection where as an adult now, like I have such a close relationship with my dad, and with my mom, like it's a struggle to maintain a relationship. So it's just like it does make a difference. Like the connection, the emotional connection, it builds something that lasts for years and into adulthood of the child.
First, Cass, let me say that I am so sorry that was your experience. I couldn't imagine having to live my formative years my adult, very public mistake years um, through the lens of social media. One of the things that I would always tell my students, and if you've heard any podcasts before, you know of my former life, don't live your life on social media. And I think that has been a blessing and a curse to generations that have been raised in social media. It has created access to things, but it is also, there's a very dark side to that. And as somebody who was an educator and I've seen it, the worst of it, you know, unfortunately, that story is really common and it gets real vicious in that world. So I am sorry that was your experience. And I am going to say the relationship that it's very, that's the essential part of parenthood, developing that relationship. However, I'm going to say to Jules's point that that is not, you can't equate that with gender affirming care. Like for me, you can't equate the two. They're not equal in that respect.
Again, when I say gender affirming, what I mean is affirming the person as they identify. I don't want to
I
bring in
understand.
any
Right. No, no,
surgeries or
no, no,
anything,
no.
but just
No,
affirming the
no.
person as they
Just
identify.
I completely understand. Clear. We're not talking that can be a part of it. We're not talking the surgeries. I understand that you're just talking about that of the validation of how you view and identify yourself. I don't think the two equate. And for me, that I guess that goes back to how you then identify, how you identify, how gender, I'm learning. I'm very big on the growth mindset. You've never read that growth versus fixed mindset book by Dr. Carol Dweck. I'll put it in in the link so you can see it. Um, Excellent book. It changed the way I taught. It changed how I taught my students, how I viewed my students. So I'm applying that mindset to gender and understanding that it's not a fixed construct. And it can be fluid, right? And I get that. And that fluidity is just that. It has ebbs, it flows, it changes, all those things. And should that change, even for people where they are fluid in their gender, you know, if you are fluid and it changes for you, then how do you take gender affirming? Because that could change. I'm not, and again, that's just how you value and how you view it. That's a different, for me, that's a different something because there's no one way to view it. There's no fixed view of it. I want to say this correctly.
So Ebony and I are different theoretical schools of thought, and I'm very, which might bring some clarity to the conversation, but I'm very existential, which basically says like all of these things are societal constructs that were created by a person. The idea of male and female, the idea of living in certain societies, the idea of marriage, all of these things are societal constructs that we apply to people. That's the way our culture is. That's what's been created. And my view is very existential, where I understand, or that's how I view it. And I view that it's very easy for people to say like, I don't fall into your structure. So for me, it makes perfect sense. Ebony's not of the existential mindset, and that's super common. Most people aren't, which is fine. So that just brings a little clarity to why our perspectives might be so different on the topic. But that's why I feel that way, and I feel like in my mind, I there's no question. Like, do you like it? It doesn't even interpret in any way. But she's of a very different theoretical approach. So it makes sense that it's different for her to view it differently.
Look at us being counselors.
So let me say it this way. So before I transition into mental health, my foundation comes from criminal justice and political science. And that is still very much a part of who I am. So when you start, the masses, the status quo, starts to say things are abuse, because there are real cases of abuse. I don't think you should be detrimental to a child. And I think this is where the conversation shifts, right? Because some people view not affirming the child as being detrimental, right? And that being abuse, not validating. But a whole lot of people don't validate their children in a whole lot of things.
The one thing that I think about when you don't affirm your child, especially if your child does identify as trans and they grow up to be trans, there is one, so even if you don't do surgery, there's one thing that is often done where they give the child hormone blockers, which they also do for gymnasts, so that they don't hit puberty. And this is a really important distinction because for those children, so say you're biologically born male, you identify as female, you're trans. If you go through puberty, you are going to have a lot of masculine features. And then if you transition at that point, you can identify and you might feel like a woman on the inside, but you're going to have a lot more masculine features. And that makes life very difficult for transgender people. Now, if you are affirmed and you are able to do the hormone blockers and you wait until don't get surgery early, but even if you wait until you're 18, 19, but you didn't go through the full onset of puberty in the gender that you don't identify with, and you are properly given hormones, that person that was biologically born male can go through the transition process and look very female without a ton of surgeries. And that mentally is a lot more supportive, and socially they pass, in quotes I say pass, so they can pass for the gender that they identify with, which leads to a lot less discrimination. So in that specific vein, there are long-term benefits to affirming people that do ultimately identify in the way that is different from what they identified outwardly as a child.
Okay, that brings so many questions, but wow. Okay, that shifts the narratives for me. So let me not shift the narrative there. I want to focus on that of an abuse, because that's what this was about. And is that abuse? Is it what Cass described in the definitions of abuse?
Is which
And
side? What are you arguing right now?
Is any of it? Is it abuse if I do that? Is it abuse if I say, let me do this gender affirming, let me give the hormones? Because the little qualifier for me, it was a qualifier. Well, gymnasts do it. Is like it's
No,
just
it's not giving you hormones, it's hormone blockers.
Right.
So you're
hormone
not
blockers.
developing.
Right. Hormone blockers. Okay.
Yes.
Let's correct and clarify. Because for me, it was hearing you. Oh, well, yeah, this is, like, let's take your multivitamins.
Well, the reason I said
it.
No, the reason I said it that way is because and that's exactly reinforcing your point. If you want to view it as child abuse for gender affirming and using hormone blockers, then you have to view doing it to gymnasts as child abuse. That's why it's asinine.
For me personally, I do. I do. I think the extremes that you put children through in those instances, I think that for me, it borders right on abuse. I think a lot of those things, but again, that's my right to think as a parent. It doesn't mean that I then have to take those beliefs that are individualistic and then now make them the status quo for the masses, because that takes away your right as a parent to affirm or not affirm your children, to validate or not validate your children, to protect or defend. I know parents that make their 5-year-olds diet because they don't want them to be fat, because they had such horrible, but see, we don't go through the genesis of things, because they had such horrible childhoods and their parents were so difficult because they were people of size or whatever the case may be. So in their mind, it's protecting their children so they don't have to experience those things. Or you push them from the time they could walk to be athletes so they don't have to live the life you lived and experience it. People have been fighting these kinds of stereotypes and beliefs for generations. I haven't seen the movie, but that's the same thing people said about the Williams sisters' father. That's the same thing they said about the Jacksons' father. You know, um, same thing they said about any someone who pushed you to be, at what point does it become, or what point does it constitute abuse? So I am very leery of saying something for the masses, although we're saying the end result is the same. The reasons justifying that are very different for me. Even if I took an existential approach, that existential approach has limited, it has boundaries for me. You know, I am very concrete constructs. Those are, you know, and that comes from my background just influences that a bit differently. And so um I am hard pressed to take away your personal freedoms and liberties. I'm very hard pressed to do that. And you're talking about a system that's so overworked. I'm not making excuse, but you're talking about a system that's so overrun and so overworked that the last thing you need to do to add to whatever it is in your state, DCFS employees, child protective service employees, like, is real abuse going on,
Yeah, children get
right?
murdered every day. You're absolutely right. I agree. I agree with you in 100%. And I agree on the liberties. I mean, if we circle back to what Cass was speaking to at the beginning about the different forms of abuse and what defines abuse, there are things that people do that, you know, maybe you don't agree with, but is there emotional trauma? You know, it depends. You know, is there emotional, are your kids emotionally traumatized? Then if they are, if you're inflicting emotional trauma on your kids, then it could be abuse. But not necessarily if you're hard on your kids or you're not affirming them for what they are, but they don't have emotional trauma. You still have a positive, you could still have a positive relationship with your child and not agree with everything that they do. That, so in that case it's not abuse. So you have to go back to what constitutes abuse, and I agree 100%. The law does not have a place in the minutia. It is a very slippery slope, and I think this law is nonsense.
To Cass's point originally, and that when we talk about abuse and when we talk about um, this, her generation, because her generation is, they're younger, right? That, and generations behind her. I think to, I don't have to agree with everything. And I don't know a kid, and I could be wrong, but I don't know a kid that didn't have some kind of emotional trauma in
Oh,
their
that's probably valid for everyone.
um I don't care, the best of
Yeah.
parents,
We all have
right?
emotional trauma. Like,
There
and
is
everybody perceives
something.
trauma differently. And that's I think that plays a key in it, because it's almost like in the state of Texas, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, as a parent, type of thing. So you get shit on by the law. If you do gender affirming care for your child, you get shit on by parents, other people you're around, and you're damned if you don't, because then your child's going through this emotional abuse where they're not being affirmed for what they believe they are at 16 years old. Because I think you have a pretty good sense of identity when you're 16. Like, you know your morals, you know your values. Are they fully developed? No, absolutely not. You do not fully develop your morals, I don't think, ever, but they're like constantly evolving. But at 16, I think you have a pretty good sense of where you want your life to go. At 16, I did. But here I am now. I wanted
I
to be a
didn't.
marine biologist, and I'm going to be a counselor now. Like, you know, it's such a weird age.
That's the key. That's the point. I think it's so subjective because
Mhm.
who I was and my trajectory for me changed at 16. So my father passing at 16 changed the entirety of who I was, who I became. It shifted. Everything shifted. So me, I think, let's take it off of that. Let's, because for me, it's not about that. It's not about whether the generation is softer, whether they're more empathetic. For me, it simply is is this a sound legal argument? I take morality out of the status quo of things, because what's moral to me may not be moral to you. My standards are different. It doesn't mean they're better or worse, they're just different. So, and I don't hold you to that standard. What you value, what you believe is what you value and what you believe. So when you start saying things like this, because then I need you to intervene on other systemic things that are happening. I need you to intervene on the systemic issues of race and financial disparities and all these kinds of things that are happening. Once you start interjecting what you're dictating to me, then you're taking away my liberties, right? Because if you do this, and I don't agree with it, it's not about agreeing with it. For me, it becomes the big picture. Because if you interject here, then you get to interject someplace else. I have now set precedent so that you can interject and say this and make this equivalent, or whatever the case may be. And I have a problem with that. I have a problem with saying that gender affirming care is abuse, and I have a problem with saying it's not abuse, because it's a gray area for me. Is this something that's forced? Is it a choice? Is it
That makes a difference. That's a strong, yeah, it could be abuse either way if, again, right, taken to the extremes. Absolutely.
So there is no one standard. There's not a status quo for me here. That you can't, what's the moral imperative? What then becomes the deciding factor? You do you understand, like, where I struggle with this at? And I really think that it could go both ways. That's just the bottom line for me. It could be that it does become an abuse of something. It could be that it's not, and then because I do not affirm, then you look at me as abusing my child because I chose not to do something. Because you don't have to agree, and I don't care what anybody says, but you don't have to agree with every area of my lifestyle for you to love me and care for me. It's not realistic. I love my son. I would lay my life down for my son, but I promise you, there's a whole lot of his lifestyle that I do not agree with. If I could change and, wave the magic wand, oh, it would be great. But it doesn't mean I don't love him. It doesn't mean I'm not going to do what I can to support him. I'm very honest about how far that goes and how far that,
the support is one thing. You can, if you're not affirming, but you support your child and you let them know that I'm going to support you in whatever you need, that's still a positive relationship. A lot of families they don't affirm, and they also, you live under my roof in one way or you get the hell out. And that's why there's a lot of, youth that are on the streets for various reasons. But yeah, it is support and relationship, and it can go to extremes on either side. It's not a one size fits all. There are way too many laws. I agree, for a multitude of things. I think there are way too many laws, and that's why so many people get incarcerated for nonsense for way too long, and then that just creates more systemic problems. So this is nonsense.
So yeah, I'm not going to go on my criminal justice soapbox, but I will say this, and I know our Spotlight Sunday just really bled over into this. I'm never, in none of the Supremes, we don't speak for each other, but I'm going to say this, flat out. No one condones abuse, right? No one condones seeking to hurt another. I think you have the right to live your life whether I agree or disagree. That's between you and God. Has nothing to do with me or whomever you believe, whatever you affirm to, whatever the case may be. I will say that there are a lot of cases of abuse. And when you see something, say something. When you see something and it doesn't sit right with you, say it. I would rather for you to report it and say it and it be found not true than to not say anything. We've talked about that on previous episodes with human trafficking and things of that nature. But there are some clear definitions of what abuse is. And everybody is not a great parent. There are levels to this thing. Sometimes parents make the joke and say the first one was the practice, so you can get the next one right, you know. But I'm laughing, and for firstborns, I'm sorry.
Hey, I broke my parents into parenting. I cried for the first 5 years of my life. You're welcome, mom and
Listen,
dad.
people have said I was a one and done, you know, and my son was a great baby, but I was a one and done. That was, you know, that's me. That's above. I understand my capacity. But you know, this is, be aware of your surroundings. Be be vocal, you know. These conversations need to be had because you need to understand. I think if we, that aspect that I talked about earlier of being exposed to more, I think being aware to more of the world and what's happening and what determines, because there's some atrocities going on in the world that for me, this doesn't even equate. And I know that sounds condescending because if this is your lived experience, it is what matters to you. However, there are some atrocities going on that for me, this doesn't even rank on that scale of some of the atrocities that are happening in the world. And I don't want to belittle this if this is where you are in your lived experience, but take this seriously. Take this idea of abuse seriously. You cannot just pay attention to you're for and no more. You know, like you have to be able to open your eyes and see the world around you and be willing to say something in support of that world around you, whether you agree or disagree, you know, but be vocal enough to say it when you see it, be aware of it. And if you are the victimizer in any of these situations, then you seek the help to be better and do better. But, you know, have the conversations, say the things, share the things, and, you know, get the support that you need so that you can be better for the next generation, whatever that next generation is for you.
I thought of something as you were talking that I saw, I think, on social media recently, kind of in the line of the law that we're talking about, but also Florida has a don't say gay bill, um, because one of the prevailing arguments or beliefs is that if a child, a heterosexual child, is exposed to someone that's not gender conforming or someone that's not heterosexual, that's going to turn them, and they're going to see it and they're going to turn that way based on what they've seen. Statistically, that has been disputed, but also this individual said homosexual children grow up reading, seeing, like living all these heterosexual relationships. That's the example that they have, and they still grow up to be gay. So if that was the scenario, if it's because they saw it, it was going to turn them, then there wouldn't be gay people. So it's just, as Ebony was saying, just open your eyes. And if you don't have to necessarily agree, but there's a difference between trying to impose your belief systems on someone else and just accepting someone for where they are. Unless it's
Yeah.
abuse, then don't accept it.
So the Child Help Hotline has 3 ways that you can contact them if you see abuse or know of abuse or are unfortunately in that situation. You can also always reach out to your local police officers, 911, in case of an real emergency situation. So there you can text or call 800-422-4453. And they do also have a live chat if you prefer to do it via text and you can't actually talk on the phone. So there are resources, and be an advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves.
Cass, I know our conversation went. Thank you for presenting this topic and allowing us to finish this conversation from our Spotlight Sunday. Sometimes the Supremes, we really just dig into something because we're all passionate and we all want better. And sometimes that better looks different. So thank you for giving us the space and honoring that in this space to do that. As a parent, as a former educator, as someone who has been on the negative side of systemic racism, of microaggressions and micro inequities, and all the wonderful terms for not so wonderful things. Abuse in any form is detrimental. So I never want to advocate for anyone to be harmed or to stay in a place where you're harmed, and seek the help, even if this is you and it is not something your family believes, your parents believe. Their resources Cass has given them. Of course, the Supremes will always put them in there. So I leave you with this quote, and I want everyone to be able to be well at the end of the day. So allow time and circumstances and not ego and vanity to reveal your wisdom. Your wisdom is subjective. It is based on your lived experience, and only your time, your particular circumstances will develop and influence whatever that wisdom is for your life. So live well.
Love that, Miss Ebony. Savannah, do you have any self-care for us?
Yeah, I would like to say, like, most of us have our boundaries or don't have boundaries, and I really think that everybody should take time to really think about what your boundaries are, for all the different situations in your life, and then start to enact them.
Love. And then oh my God, I just blanked. My mindfulness. I forgot my own segment. My mindfulness challenge for this week. So I was doing yoga the other day, and she said something that really stuck with me. Like, I had to pause my class and write this down because this is something that I'm living by now. So I want everybody to work on shifting your mindset from I am to I am experiencing. So, for example, I am depressed. That is self-loathing, that's sulking. Whereas if you say, I am experiencing, it makes it something tangible that you're able to shift, that you're able to overcome. So always do your mindful breathing and work on shifting that mindset.
Wonderful, wonderful advice, everyone. Good quote as well. So thank you everybody for sticking with our conversation. If you didn't hear the beginning of this conversation, which happened in a Spotlight Sunday and spurred spurred the rest of the conversation, definitely go back and watch yesterday's or listen to yesterday's Spotlight Sunday. You should listen to them anyways. But you'll get the full effect of the conversation if you haven't heard that. Please go back and listen, and we will see everybody next week. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, I turned into is now Cass and Savannah. It's not Cass and Savannah, it's me and Savannah. Meow.
Bye.